This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On Air.
Welcome to the OI podcast, the Otago Institute podcast, in-depth conversations with experts from the worlds of arts, sciences and mātauranga Māori. Brought to you by the Otago Institute, the Otago branch of the Royal Society for Arts and Sciences. Kia ora, I'm Dr. Barb, and today we are super lucky to have dragged her out of her annual leave holiday to have Heather Gaunt here in the studio with us. Academic Specialist, Museums and Collections Department at the University of Melbourne. I know Heather to be an artist, a musician and a researcher. What a bundle of joy you are today, Heather. Hey, thanks for coming.
It's a great pleasure, Barb. Great to be here.
And I wondered if we could just start off, if we'll just how you came to be where you are, what your journey was along the way, what your degrees and formal education were there, just what...
Yeah. How I got to this interesting point as a mid-50s career woman.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, well, I guess I've loved a lot of different arts growing up, and so I was always sort of drawing and making music as a young person, and so it seemed like the logical trajectory to go to university and study these things. And I grew up in regional Victoria in Australia, so it was always the idea to head to Melbourne like the rest of my siblings had before me, and I always had this idea of Melbourne Uni being the key destination. I don't know why. And I have ended up being most of my career at the university, so I was clearly right as a 17-year-old that it was the way to go. So I started with a music degree, which I loved, but I'd actually come out of a background of playing music in sort of school and community settings, and so I found the intensity of the music. The straight music performance degree was not my thing.
Right. What kind of music did you play?
Flautist.
Oh, yeah. Right. Oh, beautiful.
Yeah, it was good. And I loved it. And also a singer. Actually, I loved the singing more, that sort of opportunity to use your whole body in that way. But flute was great. Anyway, so then I realised that I needed to go broader, and so I started doing an arts degree at the same time. So I ended up after, I think it's 5 or 6 years, having the 2 degrees, music and honours in arts. And then,
so when you say arts, you're talking visual arts there?
No, Bachelor of Arts.
Bachelor of Arts.
No practical art.
No practical art.
Art history, literature, history subjects, that sort of thing.
So your major was art history, I guess?
It was actually, yes. Yeah. Art history and literature. But art history was the main one, which then led me into the art curatorship degree, which I was really fortunate in the 1990s was when Melbourne University just started their first art curatorship course. So I was in the second year of that degree as a graduate, which was very fortunate. This is as a postgraduate. Yeah. In those days, it was a graduate diploma, not a master's as it is now, but I think it was still a 2-year thing. Anyway, I was really fortunate as that meant that for the future of my career, it meant that there were very few of us who were graduating into this growing industry of museum professionals. And so in that space
on the ground floor.
Oh, yeah. So most of my compatriots in that year were fortunate to get great roles and to have now flourishing degrees. And I know when I am teaching into those degrees now, I feel a great deal of empathy for the young people or the people of any age who are studying those courses because there are so fewer jobs to be had for that same degree. But yeah, coming back early 90s, it was a great opportunity. I loved it and really then led me into work in museums field. So I was lucky to get an internship in my first year. So I was the first prints and drawings intern at the Balliol Library at the University of Melbourne.
Right, that would be prints?
Prints and drawings, as in works on paper.
Works on paper, so, not royalty.
No, not royalty. There were many images of royalty in that collection, as you can imagine, from a history of Western printmaking, endless Germans with their funny hats from the 16th century. Yep. Anyway, wonderful collection which required a full cataloguing because those were also the days that museums in general were digitising their collections and building their databases. So
very early days of digital.
Totally. This is when all of us were only just getting emails. This is a long time ago. So I had a wonderful year of cataloguing this collection, putting it onto the EMU, KE EMU database that the university had just acquired. And that experience both filled me with joy and delight around that beautiful aspect of works on paper, drawings, prints, because I'd always done a lot of art myself in my at home.
And your art did tend to be drawing based.
Yeah, paper based, very much. I was a paper, but drawing So a little bit of printmaking, but drawing, painting, but on paper, watercolour, pencils, that sort of thing. So it tied in really beautifully. And also, I guess the next thing the opportunity that happened was a scholarship to the British Museum, a Harold Wright scholarship. So then I was really fortunate to spend many months just being able to be in a deep dive in the prints and drawings department of the British Museum.
In London?
In London.
Wow.
Which was extraordinary. And there was no specific output that they asked from us. Harold Wright scholars were allowed to just go and explore any aspect of the collection they wanted to. And typically in the many months that you were there, you could just work your way through boxes of Dürers and Rembrandts and everything that you could want. So I started at the beginning of the history of Western printmaking because I was focusing on Western printmaking at that point. I think I got to about the late 19th century before I ran out of time, just working box by box. And the integration of my practice as an artist into the way I learnt was that I would copy essentially into my little notebook the key artworks that were really powerful for me. So that imprinted on my memory what they were like. So now I've got these great compendium in my mind of these wonderful artworks that I saw. And then I'd make little textual notes about key things like ideas of brand technique that I might have been responsive to, or something that stood out, or comparisons with different artists. So it really embedded in me this a practice scholarship where you're really haptic, engaging in creativity as well as intellectual activity, and how that really gives you a deeper learning and a much more memorable scholarly experience.
Yeah.
So that was
interesting, actually. I'm the same when I'm learning anything, when I'm at a talk or anything, I'm always taking notes. And it's funny because it's not about going back to the notes, it's about making the act of making the notes on pen and paper actually kind of embeds it in my mind, makes me focus on what the things are that I'm interested in.
And I guess that's because sounds like we're both sort of visual learners.
Yeah.
But also I notice as a musician, I'm also an auditory learner. So I'll imprint things when I'm listening to something, I'll imprint a place, or an artwork or anything. Those things match up. So to me, that the way your brain works in associations is really crucial to understanding and longevity of that understanding and memory. Yeah. So when I came back from the British Museum, I was really fortunate again to be offered a role at the University of Melbourne, back there again, as the registrar of the University Art Collection.
What does the registrar do?
A registrar is basically the organiser of a collection. So it's a term that is still commonly used in large art museums or museums today. So, for example, the registration department of the National Gallery of Victoria might have, I don't know how many staff they have at the moment, let's say there's 5 or 6 staff who are managing the database and all the text-based information, like the metadata, around the collections. And, of course, we use the tools of databases as well as paper-based records. You often work hand in hand with conservation departments, for example, or the
conservation being the conservation of the materials
art.
of the art, rather
than
conservation like Department of Conservation.
Exactly, but I mean, same principle. Like the people who are responsible for the well-being of the collection of the artworks, or the curatorial team, the directorial team. So a museum works. A large museum or art gallery works with multiple departments, of course, like any institution, all intersecting. But the registration department's prime responsibility is the management of the collection, financial, physical, all those sorts of aspects.
All the databasing. So that's different from the curator's role, because they're actually looking at the collection and the exhibitions.
Typically people who move into registration roles have got a much more their focus has to be methodical, logical.
A bit more accounting of what's there and where it is and how much it's being insured for and all those sorts of things.
Yeah, whereas curators are allowed to go off on wonderful creative exploits into anything they feel like to do with collections and have a great time. Yeah. So the nice thing in my role then at Melbourne Uni, because the museum was quite small, there was a director, a registrar and a curator, and I think a technician. Yeah. Technician being obviously the person who's going to hang the artworks or put the works on paper in temporary frames, that sort of thing. Because we were a small team, I was able, in my time then through the 90s, to move into a role that became more hybrid and allowed me to develop skills and to really embrace the curatorial side of myself, which I loved as well, so that my role was curator collections management. So I did collection management, which is essentially registration, but also curating from the collection. So I built expertise in that sort of more aesthetics, exhibition design, thinking about visitor engagement with what you're showing. So all those things that you learn a little bit about doing an art curatorship degree, but really you don't properly learn until you're thrown into the space.
And actually in practice you've got these things, and out of all of these hundreds or millions of things, depending on the size of the museum, you somehow have to put some on display in a sensible, meaningful manner that actually has some kind of resonance with the people coming in.
I have a wonderful colleague, Dr. Matthew Martin at the University of Melbourne, who I have just co-taught a course with, actually, with his art curatorship and arts and cultural management students. And he refers to that skill as discernment. And it's a beautiful word. You have to be discerning to, you have an idea for an exhibition, but all these factors impact what actually comes out the end for that sort of public product. And discernment is both aesthetic and practical. For example, the artwork that you're really excited about might turn out to have foxing in the corner and isn't the best.
What's foxing?
Okay, so coming back to conservation, so an effect of deterioration through to age, usually with acid, like you might have the paper colour literally changes because of acidic effects.
And that's called foxing.
Foxing.
That's a weird term, isn't it?
It is. I'm not going to speculate now on what it's based on. I've got a few ideas, but
I think it's coming from fox urine, eh?
Oh,
that's my guess. Like if it's talking about acid, uric acid is quite acid, and fox is known to. That's where my mind went. But goodness knows.
Anyway, so discernment. So the lovely thing about the role that then I ended up with at the University Art Museum was this beautiful combination of discernment and logic. And it is the art and science. And I think this is going to be a bit of a theme for us in our conversation over the next few minutes, because I think my career has absolutely been about that.
And we are talking about interdisciplinary, isn't it?
Yeah, well, that's right. That's where
we've decided to call this interdisciplinarity in museums. Yeah. And so that really is that bridging of arts and sciences. Yeah.
So bit of a career pause while I had a family, which was totally delightful, and I'm so glad I had the opportunity to step back and not work for a few years. In the latter part of that, I took the opportunity to do the PhD, so then I realised that it was a chance to expand again and actually did it in history.
Wow. Was that again at the University of Melbourne?
I actually did it through the University of Tasmania.
Wow. But you didn't actually go to Tasmania, did you?
And I was really fortunate. I was one of the very few people and the first people that they gave a scholarship to, even though I was living out of the state.
Right.
And it was because I think I'd had a fellowship at the State Library of Tasmania, which led into the PhD directly.
Right.
And so I guess they trusted me to do the job.
That was on history. History of?
So the fellowship was looking at the formation of the Australiana collection, in fact, the Tasmaniana collection of the State Library of Tasmania.
Wow.
So this was leaning.
So that's the
a step back.
That's the Tasmania version of Kiwiana,
exactly.
right? When we think of like the bumblebees and the tea towels and the jandals and the little four square guy, that's the Kiwiana. So the Tasmaniana, what's in Tasmania?
But in a library context, Tasmaniana is going to be things, of course, that are related to books or papers or archives. So we're not talking about little dolls or plates or things like that. It's the things that an archive or a library collects. And so Tasmaniana in this instance is paper-based collections that reflect the history of Europeans in Tasmania. And that was, again, the focus of this thesis this research for the fellowship was looking at a collection that had been donated by a particular collector called William Walker, who was collecting in the early 20th century and donated this, what became the foundational collection of what is now a really significant collection of Tasmaniana in that library.
So what sort of things were they? Were they like cookbooks or...
all sorts of things,
and
it can apply to things that are printed in Tasmania, right from the first European printing presses early 19th century.
Like just books,
in Hobart,
just general
essentially,
books and
basically.
stories and things that were printed
but also,
there. Newspapers.
You can imagine, newspapers, pamphlets. So there's, because of the cost of paper, the lack of printing presses, the lack of expertise in printing, it meant that you have a particular type of output in these what might be locally called incunabula. Incunabula is actually early printed books.
Oh, right.
In the
I've
European context.
Never heard that
it's
word
a great
before.
word, isn't it? Incunabula.
Incunabula.
Yeah.
Wow, where does that come from?
Well, clearly Latin, but I couldn't tell you the breakdown of the words themselves right now.
Yeah, so it means just early books.
It's the term for those really early printed manuscripts
and
books, like chapbooks, the ways that after the Gutenberg built the press, and so suddenly you've got this opportunity for people to have much greater access to printed matter,
like
at
political
a much lower
leaflets
price.
and things that are going
all
around.
that sort of stuff. Yeah. So, jumping back to the Tasmanian context, they're early printed material in Hobart, or things that have been printed about that place, like they might be, for example, created in London,
so stuff from London or Paris or whatever that mentions Tasmania.
Yeah, for example,
or
to
Sydney
the
or Melbourne for
penal
that matter.
period in Tasmania. Or
because Tasmania was a penal colony as well, wasn't it?
Yeah, and this is Tasmania has a really difficult history, which is they still are grappling with today, of course, as are people all over Australia, around the terrible treatment of the First Nations people in Tasmania, and in parallel in this particular period, the particular conditions of convicts being sent to Australia who, as we know, come from a variety of backgrounds and many of whom had appalling conditions in which they had to conduct their lives as well. So,
and a strange society that was formed
because of those
because
factors.
You get those factors, and also sort of the gender balance must have been crazy as well, I imagine.
Well, that would definitely tie into it, and just that sort of imbalances of everything, access to resources,
and the skills of
life.
And also, I guess, just communities that have been pulled apart from the people that they were a community with and thrown together in another context. As well. Like it's not like a general immigration when people come as families. People come.
No, it's very
completely different sort of scenario to that.
And you got a bit of that, of course, of the colonisers coming in and setting up farms, but then those people would be having essentially slaves in the form of penal labour, or First Nations people who are, So it's a very difficult history, which is then combined with this extraordinarily beautiful and evocative environment, which is Tasmania itself. So it's and I think the fact that it's an island, it's a self-contained entity in a way that you don't find this character anywhere else in Australia. So I was always very fascinated with Tasmania as a place. And in fact, my interest that led me to the fellowship at the State Library came from I'd actually done a couple of years of a first PhD that I didn't finish, but did a lot of research and published some articles out of, which looked at a collector who was based on the west coast of Tasmania, Robert Sticht.
Ah, right.
And he was an extraordinary figure, even more interesting than William Walker, really, because he was a brilliant metallurgist, invented pyritic smelting. Pretty sure he invented it. Anyway, he applied it to great effect on the west coast of Tasmania.
Wow.
This
Mike,
mining...
you should elaborate on pyritic smelting. It's just really hot. I don't know.
It's the non-scientist in me. I can't tell you a lot more about pyritic smelting.
Yeah, no, amazing.
Yeah, very hot. And there's certain
But he wasn't a
types
jeweler. He was looking for
he was a miner.
metal.
He was a mine manager.
Yeah.
So he was a mining engineer who came from America, was extremely intellectual. And this was the fascinating thing and why I started this piece of research prior to going on leave when I had my family. So this was the late 90s, and the National Gallery of Victoria actually approached me because of my history in print scholarship.
Oh, right.
And said, we've got this amazing collection that had been acquired from the collection of Robert Sticht. We don't know that much about it. This would be a great topic. And it really was. And so he was also very meticulous. He would have been a great registrar of collections.
Right.
So he had wonderful lists of his acquisitions, which included not only lots of artworks, works on paper in Cannabula, coming back to these early books.
printed things.
Yeah, so he had a really a little sort of a mini cosmos collection of history of Western printmaking, plus artworks, plus some First Nations objects from Australian treasures from Australians, both Tasmanian and further abroad, First Nations cultures from around the world. That wasn't a big part of the collection, but it was sort of typical of that 19th century
collectors
magpie collecting where you had availability. So, and the extraordinary thing about Robert Sticht is that he did this while running a mine and being an engineer and designing the whole setup, and then in very, very remote conditions on the west coast of Tasmania. So he was essentially buying. I was fascinated by the trade aspect of it. You know, how do objects, these high, refined, really delicate objects, like imagine a work on paper in a rainforest.
Yeah, imagine it just even on a ship being shipped around. It's just craziness, isn't
and
it?
He's not putting it in a museum. They're coming to his home. He built a nice house, but nevertheless in Queenstown, and amassed this amazing collection. So
is the place that he was in Queenstown?
Yeah, in Queenstown.
Oh, how weird is that?
Yeah,
there must be Queenstown across
Tasmania.
There must be Queenstowns across the Commonwealth. Anyway, just
quite a small town.
But just
and
for
very remote.
Not being ambiguous here, it's not the Queenstown in Central Otago, folks.
No, Queenstown, Tasmania, West Coast Tasmania.
Wow.
Sort of similar vibe, interestingly. Like it's very mountainous, really beautiful, surrounded by forest. I mean, Queenstown, New Zealand, not so much.
Yeah.
But
well, I
very
mean,
beautiful.
it's got the whole of Fiordland National Park behind it, though.
Well, true.
So,
yeah, you're right. So it is relatively similar.
Yeah.
Anyway, so this interest in and because it was about Tasmania, Tasmanian collectors, this fascination with place, because I was always so interested in environment and the countryside, I guess. I grew up as a country girl, and my sense of connection to place has always been really, really significant in how I understand myself and my identity in whatever aspect of my life. So this was like one of those bridging projects where you are combining a fascination with high culture in the form of this prints and drawings collection and beautiful, remote, wild, cold rainforest environment. It was a wonderful project.
And sort of a really rich person.
Well, yeah.
I mean, he must have had all the luxuries of everything if he was spending money buying prints and
so.
having a big house there, but in a really remote area. So it must have been quite hard to get things there. I mean, everything came by ship.
Oh, totally.
Everything came by ship. And
then horse and cart. And then they built a railway up in there. There's this amazing rack and pinion, I think it's called, railway, going up a steep hill from Strawn, which is on the coast of West Coast Tasmania, where the ships would come in.
Oh, so Queenstown's actually quite inland.
Queenstown's inland, yeah.
Oh,
so it's a few hours ride.
As is Queenstown and Central Otago.
Yeah, lots of similarities.
Crazy.
Quite a steep rail, extremely precipitous, through virgin rainforest essentially at that point. And then it turns up in this essentially like a remote mining town. And he's built a house on the top of a hill in which these things go. And he travelled a bit for work, but because the company, Melbourne was the base of the company, the Mount Lyell Mining and Railway Company, I think that was the title of it. So he would have to go over there and do reports occasionally.
And I guess people like that, they have buyers and things, overseas friends who look for things.
Agents.
And things. Yeah, agents.
Exactly. So you have a relationship with an agent and they spot things. And so then he had also kept the catalogues of various sales. So as a researcher, it was really fascinating to see, okay, this was the particular sale that he tracked this item down in 1911, or he bought this whole job lot.
Oh, fantastic for tracing things back when you've got the exact provenance there, how much it was sold for and compared to the other things that were in the sale as well. And you know, was it a really, was he always going for the most expensive thing, or was he really...
and that wasn't the case. And in fact, that's the really interesting thing of art scholarship, or art historical scholarship, is that investigation of the relationship between the individual buyer and what their idea of aesthetics or what they want to create in terms of their collection. Like the study of collections and the creation of collections is hugely interesting. And then what are the social and historical contexts, and in this case, the geographical contexts of acquisition. And who is he showing this off to? Is it a really private collection?
Does he just want it for himself?
Yeah. And then in the instance of Robert Sticht's collection is that it ends up through the Felton bequest, which was one of the major funds that the the National Gallery and Museum in Victoria, Melbourne, had. So through the Felton bequest, they acquired the prints and drawings collection from Robert Sticht's estate when he died in the 1920s. That went to what is now the wonderful print collection of the National Gallery of Victoria. And then the book collection ended up in what is now the State Library. At that time, it was all one entity.
Right.
So essentially they purchased it through the Felton bequest and then it was split into two. So that's also an interesting part of research into this sort of area, because you are putting together the history of collections as they move through time.
And why was it in two? Like, at that point, he'd put everything together and then someone else has come along and decided we're going to split this collection into two parts based on whatever they decided, whether it was
based on media.
So
essentially, it's like that division that you make between a bound book or an unbound
pamphlet or something.
Yeah. So, or more, the pamphlets and the books end up together, but then the single sheets that may have been taken out of bound books may end up in the art collection.
Right.
So it's totally fascinating. So it was the interest in Sticht that I did the work while I was working full time. So it was a sort of part-time PhD for a couple of years. Really was so fascinating because it led me to the Tasmanian interest, and it also with William Walker. And it made me realise when I came back after having kids and I realised it was time to restart the PhD journey that I actually did want to start again though, and I wanted it to be a more expansive lens than just prints and drawings, I guess, and this one person. I needed the bigger picture. Maybe it's something about having kids. You need the bigger picture.
Or just having the time as well to think through it, because I think once you start on a PhD, you can get kind of focused in on that, and there's the time limit and there's everything else going on, and then if you're able to have that break and step back, and then you get that sort of broader picture and think, that's like just that step back. But it might, who knows? But who knows what causes these things? But
and always with time, you do get to
and you change as well. Like you grow and you see other things, and you think. And even though you step back, you're still thinking about the things that you were learning there and putting them in other contexts, and then thinking about them, and then I don't know. In some ways, you can't help but sort of widen.
Oh, absolutely. And I am quite genuine when I say that parenting, like being a parent, changes how you look at the world. And so for me, because every aspect of, like I think for everybody, but every aspect of how I live is all interconnected and needs to have meaning. So the project that I would want to then spend 3.5 years intensely needed to have a bigger message, I guess, than looking at one particular person. And so that's why, and I loved every second of it. In fact, the PhD that I did with the University of Tasmania, which was in history and essentially cultural history, and looked at the idea of historical consciousness and the formation of collections in archives being the beginning. Archives started in libraries in Australia. So essentially there weren't distinct archives by themselves until the 20th century. So in the 19th century, archives are part of library collections. And so so the Tasmanian example was a really beautiful little test case to say, how does a community, for all the reasons we've just talked about before about Tasmania,
decide what things are worth keeping.
Or not so much even worth keeping, actively acquiring. And there's a difference, because a library that'll take too long to talk about. I was going to talk about this idea of, how when books are published, books come to libraries.
Oh,
And so there's collections that are necessarily acquired through legislation or through the conditions of publication.
Like anything you publish in New Zealand with an ISSN number, you have to put a copy of it in the National Library.
Exactly.
You have to send them to them, and that means that they have a complete archive of anything that's published in New Zealand. And I imagine there's something similar in Australia.
Exactly.
And I think that's an amazing rule.
It's a wonderful phenomenon, which wasn't in place as a strategy when what they did call them national libraries for each of the then states, but they're colonies of Australia prior to federation in the early 20th century. They had to actively decide what they were going to collect. It was more, what collections does this community need at this point? And this comes out of a really 19th century overt, not manipulation, but an overt mission from things like the Carnegie libraries, for example, which are all about providing reading resources for everybody.
Right.
So it was a really wonderful social mission that early libraries had in communities.
Yeah.
And along with that, there's a lot of responsibility and choice about the types of collections that get there. And so then you can come back to saying, well, the people who get to make those choices, what do they want people to know?
Yeah.
And how do they want them to feel about their local environment? And from that, you go, okay, so let's match what the collection looked like here in this point in time and this point in time and this point in time moving forwards, and match that against, for example, public policies or library policies at the closer level, or what's going along more at a wider societal level. And
so we're talking about the early 1800s or right?
No, so
more like the 1880s,
1870s in Tasmania. It was that sort of period onwards that libraries, when we're just talking
so
the
that sort
Australian
of late
context
Victorian
here.
era there, the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s. And at that stage, New Zealand would have been in a very similar sort of, probably even, from some Australians considered one of the colonies.
Yeah. And this sort of moralising mission of public libraries was a really big thing. And the Carnegie libraries that were funded from American Carnegie funds.
Big,
New
rich,
Zealand.
rich, fancy family.
Totally. And New Zealanders also got Carnegie libraries, as did Australia. So it was the way that a lot of smaller libraries were created in communities. Really, really important.
That they'd be bothered
phenomenon.
with Australia, New Zealand, wouldn't it? But I think they're represented on the Gilded Age. If anyone's watching that show with all the fancy dresses and the rich people doing rich people things,
that would be. Yeah.
And it would have been, I imagine, quite different what they were reading themselves. Compared, like as that kind of them and their peers, compared to what they thought would be beneficial to have in a library.
And this is coming out of a English class system where you're absolutely right. And even that is fascinating, thinking about how class is defined and reinforced by the literature that people have access to. And an example would be not having novels in libraries
I was just about to ask that. What was the balance between fiction and non-fiction? Was it mostly sort of farming annuals and how to raise chickens and how to I don't know, do farming, how to do agriculture, how to do sewing, cooking, those sorts of practical skills, or was it, great classics?
It was definitely a combination of those two things, but it definitely wasn't penny dreadfuls that you might be able to buy at the railway station or something.
Yeah.
So this moralising mission notion, but as you say, also very practical, utilitarian. As we know, utilitarianism is a key phenomenon at the time. So getting back to the interest that I had in this exploration of Tasmanian identity through literature, and then I was fascinated to apply some sort of theoretical ideas to how an individual object might represent. So we've seen a library collection or an archive collection as a representative of a way to test, a litmus test of society, if you like. And then I thought, well, what if you look at a single item and see how that tracks through time? And so I looked at a particular text called by Henry Savery, who was a convict writer.
Right.
So it was basically a story about Van Diemen's Land from the period, and so looking at how this text was originally given to the public library in Tasmania, and then it was sold, and that sort of removal of memories of the penal past, and so the book represented how people didn't want to have any concrete memories or documentation of this, such that there's evidence that families were removing lists of their penal ancestors from some of the official books in the government archives.
So this book, it was like he wrote his story down. As an autobiography type thing, or as a fiction?
Novel. It was fiction. The Convict of Van Diemen's Land, I think.
And Van Diemen's Land
is the earliest name for what we then are calling Tasmania, and we now call Tasmania. Yeah. So that was fascinating too, and that really triggered for me this interest in an object. The theory I was looking at was Pierre Nora, who was a French theorist, and he was looking at l'heure de mémoire. So the idea of an object having memories attached to it, but not just individual memories, but sort of societal memories. And then if we can look at how that object or that place in Pierre Nora's estimation is, as I said, a way of testing changing societal perceptions of your own history or your own place. And so,
you can see that, and I think if you look at like really famous examples like the sunflowers and Van Gogh, and nobody cared about it at the time, and then they became, and then they you know, and
that's a great example, because if you think about how now people access it in digital form.
Yeah.
So even seeing how as a
everywhere.
medium,
like there's sunflowers everywhere. You can get it on pencil cases and things. It's all sort of all over the places. Yeah. Or the other one that I think is really interesting is The Last Supper, because that was for years just moulding away in a stable, and then all through the war, and then it got found again, and now you can charge X number of euros to go and see it, and there's lines everywhere. And it's that kind of thing where it was really esteemed, and then it fell out of favour, and it sort of got lost, and then it just became this kind of really damp thing. All the paint was peeling off. It was, total wreck. And then it's come back up again. So it's that kind of...
I think your use of the word esteem is really interesting. And it's, what we give high aesthetic or cultural credit value to at any point is super interesting. Yeah.
And what we want to hide away, that's interesting with sort of, because I think in some ways we've come not completely full circle, but I think we're on the way back round to sort of thinking, actually this is our past, this is our history. We actually need to deal with, I don't know how it is in Australia compared to New Zealand, but I think there's a lot of kind of feeling that, yes, it was terrible, it was atrocious, a lot of really horrible things have happened, but pretending they didn't happen doesn't actually allow us to progress. And we need to actually acknowledge things that have happened, and then, maybe there is no solution as such to them, but things need to move forward, and you can't do that if you just pretend that it didn't happen, if you're just trying to erase history.
Exactly. And our cultural institutions, right from individual artworks through to whole cultural institutions, are fantastic vehicles for considering that question and making use of those resources so that we don't forget, so that we step forward more positively. Learn from the past. Don't forget. Yeah. But
it's interesting having that discussion about really engaging with the fact that the people making these collections had quite a bias and quite an effect on the collections themselves as the starting point, because it's very tempting to just say what we have that's left over from any time in history is what it was like. But of course there's all those, things, some things last and some things don't last, some things are acquired, some things are preserved, some things aren't. And it's actually really interesting to take all those things into account and kind of, because
which is a really nice segue actually to think about if we continue on the slow chronological narrative that we're undertaking, is the Percy Grainger Museum, where I do a lot of work now at the University of Melbourne.
I have had Heather on about this, because this to me just seems that it's just amazing. It's a whole museum basically about one person.
Created by. So it's like the epitome of the idea of creating a collection that is really biased and self-centred, which we touched on, but then by making it a museum where you expect researchers or the public to come is a whole other step.
Yeah.
And this autobiographical museum context. So before I talk about that in more detail, I should situate the Percy Grainger Museum. So it's within the University of Melbourne and one of the multiple museums and collections that the university manages. It's a really it's very rich in terms of its cultural resources, and I'm really fortunate and have, I guess, really played upon the fact that we do have this great diversity of material, and we are within a university, and therefore this opportunity to engage our museums and collections in innovative and interdisciplinary ways with our students across all faculty is so interesting. It's underpinned the last sort of 12 years of my career.
And it is quite interesting in comparison to, for instance, Dunedin here, because the Otago Museum, Tahura, used to be part of the University of Otago, and then they split. So historically, the Otago Institute sort of slightly outdates. That was the kind of the first formation of learned people wanting to gather together and talk about interesting educational things, which I imagine is how the University of Melbourne started. And then there was a big geology collection was here somehow, and that formed the start of the Otago Museum, and then from that the University of Otago grew. So they were kind of connected, even though now people just looking on the surface, they're completely distinct entities. And I guess that just evolved in a separate way in Australia, where the museums have kind of remained part of the university. I mean, ours is adjacent, it's literally across the street, but yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, it is interesting, and so many universities around the world are very fortunate to have lots of resources, both artistic and scientific, which come from that intellectual scholarship created by the academics, who have worked there over many generations, really. And I think it's just in individual cases, where does the split happen? Sometimes, as you've indicated at Otago, it becomes a separate institution. Sometimes most of the collections continue to be managed by the university. The International Council of Museums, ICOM, and then UMAC, University Museums and Collections, so there's a sub-branch, is a really active international body of people who, like myself, work in campus-based or university-based museums and collections. And you realise that it's an incredible resource which often people, members of the public in general, don't realise it's there. Partly because it does tend to be, they do tend to be collections that are used primarily for academic purposes. And so,
I guess the Hocken Library here is a classic example, because it's a library, but it is an archival research library. You can't take things out. You go there and research and study things. And we've had Rohina on here from the Hocken Library talking about it, and it was a fantastic interview. And a lot of people, as you say, public just don't realise that anyone can just go and,
Yeah, well, in some cases you can't necessarily just go, but
you have to sign in and you have to leave all your stuff at the door, and there's rules and regulations.
Yeah, that's right. I guess some of those more unique or site-specific collections may not be as accessible to the public, but like all museums, if you've got the resources, we're trying to make these resources more accessible to the public, typically through digitisation processes and really good websites. So,
and of course that takes time and energy and money
Yeah. So yes, like many universities around the world, Melbourne Uni has this great and diverse collection. And when I finished my PhD, I came back and started working back at what was then called the Ian Potter Museum of Art, so the University Art Museum, where I'd been prior to having kids and PhD, had moved into a beautiful new building, changed its name, and was a much more active place. And so I came in a new role, which was curator of academic programs. Another fabulous academic, Dr. Amanda Burrett, had been in the role, I think, for maybe a year prior to me, and had started it. Essentially got it up and running, but I really remember the first board meeting I had at the Art Museum as a new staff member there, where the head of the board said to me, okay, so your mission is to go off and bring in students from across the entire university, not just the archaeologists or the historians or the art curators. Right. I want everyone. And I was like, that's a fantastic mission. I'm on it. And it was so great. So essentially I just went out there and in the first months I'd be sending off many, many emails. I literally cold calling academics across the entire campus, going through the massive University of Melbourne handbook for subjects that looked like they had interesting titles that I could link to something. Yeah. And of course I was in an art museum which had multiple exhibitions on at any time. We could also draw on the collections, which fortunately, because of my history as the curator and registrar, I knew intimately. Yeah. So I could do this matchmaking essentially between an academic's teaching and learning outcomes that they're looking for, their TILOs, the collections that I thought I could bring in to instrumentalise to the purpose that I would match with the academics. So I haven't explained that very well. But
No,
it's
but
such a great...
Just
so
matching
much
up
fun.
stuff that they nobody would know was there,
and they
except
didn't
someone
even know
who'd
was
been
there.
through the registrar and seen everything that's in the museum.
So when you say that the public don't know what's in university collections, it's also the case that most academics are not aware of the diversity. They may know a little part of it, but most academics that I work with, and of course at the university there's thousands, or I don't work personally with thousands, but there are thousands
of academics there,
of course, most of them may have never thought of engaging their students with a museum.
Yep.
So in that case, it was really, let's go out, let's bring you in. So it might be engineering students doing
but it's all of the
geometry.
art, right? So it's just the art museum part of
and
it.
the physical environment. So it is this combination of place, the aesthetic encounter, and the co-teaching. So I was always, typically we'd co-teach. So I'd start this relationship with the academic to say, what do you want? This is what I think we can offer. We'd shape up something. It might be a suite of tutorials for a particular week of a subject, or it might be a semester-long engagement, and then we'd typically co-deliver. And when they were really successful, which they typically were, we'd do some research. So scholarship of teaching and learning, SOTL research, where you saw qualitative outcomes or quantitative outcomes from student engagement. How much did this experience impact their learning? And so I've published with academics in areas like VetSci about improving observation skills by looking at Dürer prints.
What's a Dürer print?
Dürer is Albrecht Dürer, so one of these artists of the Renaissance
it's the name of a
period.
person.
Dürer, D-U-R-E-R.
Is that cross Tasman?
Yeah, sorry. And then my real passion then became medicine, dentistry, health sciences. So I really have carved out an area of expertise in this space of bespoke engagements for those areas and with those academics. And now it's come to the point where I co-developed and now co-run a subject in medical humanities with a wonderful colleague, Dr. Rosie Shea,
cool.
in the
And what's
Department
that?
of Medical
How do you
Education.
do that? Is that looking for like signs of illnesses and paintings or?
Yeah, well, it's a 4-week intensive, and so basically we use the environments. We've matched different types of museum environments and different sort of aesthetic and skill-based encounters to the themes of each week. So the first week is based on visual acuity and moral imagination, and we have a Friday field trip for a whole day into the art gallery.
Visual acuity and moral imagination. What's moral imagination?
Well, if you think around...
visual acuity, that's just
sort of
looking
easy,
at something,
practicing
right?
your visual observation skills.
Yeah.
This is a wonderful, easy thing to do in an art museum in all sorts of different ways, but practicing those skills, but you're doing it with something that is also adding an emotional, aesthetic element. So coming right back to when we started about learning, and you learn more when you're engaging all your senses. So I'm not just describing those headphones sitting on the table next to me in great detail. I could do that, but I'd get more value from describing a really complex artwork by, let's say, a early 20th century Indigenous artist who's reflecting on their experience of the encounter with white people on country or something, or whether it's a European 16th century narrative painting. So that's the visual acuity bit, and I could talk to you for a long
let's
more
skip
about
over that.
Let's
Just take that as read. Yep.
But the moral imagination part of it comes from developing empathy and understanding of human encounter, I guess, and relationship. And so if we think about
impressionist painting of a brothel compared to a aristocratic portrait, is that where no?
Yeah, that's a sort of one little instance of the literal connection that you've made. But if we think more broadly about what it is that we want, for example, our health professionals in training to become, we want them to be really great at relating to their future clients or patients. So they need to be able to have a human connection. And so I think it's generally agreed that encounters with visual culture or other forms of artistic culture are going to enhance your ability to be empathetic, to think about the other person's perspective, a self-reflectivity. There's a huge amount of literature on this, and while it's hard to quantify in research studies, there have been attempts to measure, and in fact I've done a study with a colleague in dentistry where we were teaching her special needs dentistry students. That was Dr. Mina Borromeo.
So that's dentistry students with special needs?
No, dentistry students who are training. Part of their training is to work with clients with special needs. And so the complexity, for example, of, well, for the student, simply the message, you are not just dealing with their tooth with a filling.
Yeah.
What you're working with is a family who possibly have come to you. You may have a child who may be on the spectrum who is really struggling with the bright orange that you've chosen to put in your clinic and the sound of the drill. And what are you actually going to do as a caring clinician to support them as a whole person, not just thinking about what needs to go in their tooth?
Yeah.
So that's actually a really great example of the leap between the practical, technical skills that are often associated with health sciences training and the human-centred skills that we want all of our health professionals who, when they deal with us, when we walk in off the street, we want them to understand us.
Yeah, and you're getting no argument from me
at
all.
That's right.
It's
from anyone.
It's a really massive thing in that we kind of and we kind of push our medical students along the road of technical skills, and that whole kind of human part is really a very small part of the training, whereas actually dealing with the people and, even if it's just a matter of, clinically you're going to get a better history, you're going to get a better result apart from all of the other empathy things. You are going to find out a better history, you're going to have better outcomes and people, if they feel more comfortable being able to talk to, for instance, their GP or their consultant or their anaesthetist, if they feel more comfortable in that situation, like they're being heard, they're being listened to, they're being taken seriously, they're more likely to go in the first place and they're more likely to tell that person the relevant information that they need to know, because there's that whole trust issue. And I think it's a really important thing. It's interesting to think of it going through the sphere of art.
Yeah, it's an environment in which you can practice those skills in a non-hierarchical, safe way. Yeah. Once the parameters of the learning have been set up, people enter that space. You might spend 3 hours or 5 hours in a gallery supported by typically a clinician. So I'll always work, in this instance, with Rosie Shea, who is a medical doctor, and myself coming from the museum expertise, and together we support them in their interpretation, their use of metaphor, self-reflection. As you were saying before, in that instance of the painting that you were talking about, yes, you encourage the students to explore the potential narratives that are and ideas that are associated, that emerge from them in this thoughtful, long, so not fast, not quick, it's all about long, managing ambiguity, managing the fact that, you're not going to know the answer, or there isn't an answer in what this artist is presenting. It's a little snapshot of the richness and diversity of experience. And then this idea of translational activity at the end of the task, where the clinical teacher typically will bring it back to really practical examples, like we're saying, okay, well, these are the sorts of conversations we've had about this. What did you think? What did we do here? Or what was the conversation? And that's the joyful part of museum teaching, is that every session is different, because it's not about instructing them about what's in the art or about the context of the art or anything. It's about working through the encounter with rich and fascinating and evocative visual art contexts. Yeah. Or in the case of our subject, might be musical contexts or others. So we don't just stick with the visual arts. Yeah. So exploiting those in the best possible way. And the great thing is that the students, you'll have some resistance sometimes, but the general response.
I'm sure it's really uncomfortable for some people to start with. They've never come across anything like that.
Particularly if it's contemporary art and it's like way beyond anything that they've wanted to encounter before. It's just like, what am I doing here looking at this thing?
How is this going to help me? What's the point of this? I can really see that.
So but the journey itself is so important. And even if you only get some of the way, and that's why multiple sessions is great. So and it's nice with our 4-week intensive, because we get to build trust over that time.
With the class as a whole.
And we really noticed, like we went to the Immigration Museum in Melbourne on the 3rd week last time and had task, which is called the personal response tour, where you go off and you actually then have the agency to choose an object that fascinates you, associate a personal story, share safely with your group. Again, the context of safe conversation, and what we say in this room doesn't go beyond it. So, and it's extraordinary, the sorts of narratives that come out, but also the relationship that builds in the small group who are then listening, asking a question, sharing. Then it always gets brought back to, remember what happened in this clinical context or something. So it's incredibly empowering work.
It's interesting, and just being able to think about different contexts and different people, and and the background that adds into their story and how it is. I don't think we've got time today to get into Percy Grainger. I know. How affronted would he be?
He'd be very affronted, I can tell you that.
Well, I don't know. I think that most people in New Zealand, would find the notion of Percy. I mean, I didn't know who he was. I don't know that most people in New Zealand do. I imagine he's quite a big person in Australia.
He is now. He was temporarily forgotten in the late 20th century, I think, but he was huge. He was one of our most internationally famous musicians, composers in the first half of the 20th century. Yeah. And then, built this museum at Melbourne Uni. But he's a really complex character. So this is just really briefly, this is the contrast of an art collection in which you can choose an individual artist. But the Percy Grainger collection is all about this one person who's problematic as well as brilliant. Yeah. And so you can have these really different tussling conversations with students.
Hey, thank you so much for coming along, Heather. It's been fantastic, and we really, really appreciate you taking this time out of your holiday, and we wish you the best for the rest of the holiday. I'm sure that Ōtepoti Dunedin is going to give you a fantastic, sunny rest of the week.
Thank you, Barb.
And just quickly before we hand off, incunabul or incunabulam is any early printed book, especially one printed before 1501. So it's those very early ones, as Heather said. Thank you very much. You've been listening to the OI podcast, the shout out for the arts, sciences and Mataranga Māori.
You can support this podcast by becoming a member of the OI. Check out the Otago Institute for Arts and Sciences on Facebook or our website.
If you'd like to listen again to this episode or others from the series, look for the OI podcast on OAR-FM's website, oar.org.nz.
Brought to you by the Otago Institute for Arts and Sciences, the Otago branch of the Royal Society of New Zealand.
This podcast was produced by OAR-FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On the Air.